You want to know the truth, Dad? You've never been a gift in my life. You're a weight.
After all I've done, that's what you see?
Yes, and if you really want to give me something for your birthday, disappear. Just be gone.
I am William Foster, and for 70 years I've carried many titles: husband, father, worker, provider. But never, in all those years, did I expect my own flesh and blood to hand me such a sentence. His voice didn't shake when he said it. Mine almost did when I answered with silence. I had learned long ago that silence, at the right time, holds more power than any outburst. And that night, as I sat in the dim light of my kitchen, the echo of his words clung to me like smoke. I thought of all the mornings I woke before dawn to keep a roof over his head, of all the years I carried 2 jobs after his mother died. I remembered his first bike, the one I bought with money I didn't really have. I remembered the nights I stayed awake so he could sleep without hearing the sound of my tears. And now, on the edge of my own birthday, he wanted me gone. But not everyone in that house felt the same. There was one soul who still saw me with wonder in his eyes, my grandson. To him, I wasn't a burden. I was a hero, a fortress, the safe place he ran to when storms broke out in the family. That evening, before I made my choice, I knelt beside his bed. He was already in pajamas, clutching that old toy truck I once fixed for him. I whispered gently, "Grandpa's going on a trip, but one day I'll be back to see who you've become. This is our little secret, okay? Don't tell your dad." His eyes lit up with the kind of trust only a child can give. He nodded, as if we had just sealed a pact larger than life itself. From that moment, my plan began to take shape. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. Instead, I acted. Quietly, decisively. The next morning, the first thing I did was cancel the funding that kept his world comfortable. Mortgage payments, allowances, extras, gone. By the end of the week, I had closed the accounts he leaned on like crutches. I left without slamming doors. I simply vanished from his world. But I didn't vanish from everyone's. My daughter, his sister, had always been different. Forgotten in the shadows of his brother's demands, she carried strength I hadn't praised enough. When I told her of my decision, she didn't argue, she understood. She agreed to help me carry out the silence, to shield her brother just enough so he wouldn't fall too fast, but not enough to spare him the lesson he needed most. So I stepped away. From the outside, it looked like I had disappeared, maybe even died. That's exactly what he believed. And while he lived in that illusion, I kept watch from the distance, not for him, but for the boy who still called me Grandpa. What my son didn't know yet was that the gift he asked for was about to become the curse that would change his life forever. I didn't leave with noise. I left like a shadow, quiet, deliberate, and certain. My son believed I was still there, a silent machine funding his every choice. But by the end of that week, the truth began to settle in. The mortgage payments he relied on vanished first. Then the stream of money that kept his family living comfortably dried up. I had cut every cord, one by one, until the safety net he never noticed was gone. From a distance, I imagined his face when he checked his accounts. At first, I knew he would blame the bank. He always had an excuse, always someone else to carry the fault. But excuses don't pay bills. Excuses don't keep the lights on. Meanwhile, I found refuge a few towns away, in a modest place no one would think to look. I didn't need luxury. I had spent my whole life providing it for others. What I needed now was silence, and the space to watch how my absence would change everything. My daughter visited me the next evening. She carried groceries, but more than that, she carried an understanding that words couldn't capture. "You're sure about this, Dad?" she asked. "I am," I told her. "He'll never learn if I keep holding him up." She nodded, and for the first time in years, I felt her loyalty shine brighter than her brother's entitlement ever had. But the one I missed most was my grandson. I knew he was expecting me to return from my trip. I pictured him waiting at the window, scanning the driveway, believing that one day soon I'd come back with stories. That trust both warmed and broke me. Back at my son's house, the unraveling had already begun. He called me several times, his tone shifting from irritated to demanding, then finally to confused. I didn't answer. He left a message. "Dad, something's wrong with the accounts. Call me back." I didn't. The following week, my daughter told me he had stormed into her place, waving overdue bills and demanding answers. She played her role perfectly, offering him calm words, but no solutions. She knew, just as I did, that until he felt the weight of responsibility himself, nothing would change. Still, I wasn't absent entirely. Late at night, I drove by their neighborhood. From the street, I could see the warm light of my grandson's room. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of him through the window, playing with that toy truck. Those were the nights I whispered promises into the dark. "I'm still here, little one. I haven't left you." Days turned into weeks. My son grew more restless. His pride was a fortress crumbling brick by brick, though he tried to patch the cracks with anger. He blamed the bank, the system, even his sister. But deep down, I knew the day would come when he'd run out of excuses and finally face himself. What he didn't know, what he couldn't even imagine, was that his world was no longer under his control. For the first time in his life, he was standing without my shadow beneath him. And shadows, once gone, leave a man face to face with the light he's been avoiding. At first, I thought my son would crack quickly under the weight of reality, but pride is a stubborn thing. It shields a man long after the truth has started to bleed through. Weeks passed. The mortgage sat unpaid, late notices piled on the counter, yet he kept his head high, as if the world owed him another chance. He blamed the bank, cursed the system, and shouted at anyone who dared remind him of the bills. To him, the problem wasn't his dependence, it was the world's injustice. My daughter told me of the nights he would storm into her house, pacing back and forth, waving papers, demanding help. She kept her word, steady as stone. She offered him nothing but calm, a hand on his shoulder, and silence where he wanted answers. He mistook her silence for indifference, not realizing it was the only lifeline keeping him afloat. One evening, as I watched from the distance, I caught sight of my grandson sitting on the porch. He was drawing with chalk, his little hands smeared with colors. I parked where he couldn't see me and watched him sketch clumsy shapes on the concrete. Then I heard him whisper to his father, who had just stepped outside. "When Grandpa comes back from his trip, I'll show him this." The boy's voice was light, hopeful. My son froze for a moment, his face caught between confusion and irritation. "Your grandpa isn't coming back. Stop talking like that." The boy lowered his head, and my chest ached. He was too young to carry the weight of his father's bitterness. Inside me, anger stirred. I wanted to step out of the shadows, to take my grandson into my arms and tell him the truth, that I was still here, still watching. But I stayed put. This wasn't the time. The lesson had to run its course, no matter how much it tore at me. The following week, the cracks grew wider. My son sold a few possessions, electronics, old furniture, anything to buy more time. He thought selling trinkets could mend the hole in a sinking ship. But each sale was another stone tied to his pride, dragging him deeper into the reality he refused to face. Then came the argument. My daughter told me he had shouted at her, accusing her of hiding money, of knowing where I was. She stayed calm, but her words cut sharp. Maybe the problem isn't Dad. Maybe it's you. He didn't answer. Instead, he slammed the door, leaving her in silence. That night, I sat alone in my small apartment, thinking of him. He was a grown man, yet I could still see the boy I once carried on my shoulders. The boy who laughed when I pushed him on the swing. The boy who believed I could fix anything. Now, he couldn't see past his own pride to realize I was still fixing his life, just not the way he expected. The house of cards he lived in was trembling. But a man can hold on to his illusions longer than you'd believe. He thought the storm was temporary. He thought he could weather it alone. What he didn't see, what he refused to see, was that the storm wasn't passing. It was just beginning.
3 months had passed since I vanished from his world. 3 months of silence, overdue notices, and a pride that refused to bow. But even pride has a breaking point. I heard from my daughter that the arguments in his house had grown sharper. The bills stacked higher on the table, and the voices behind closed doors carried the tone of desperation. He still walked into town with his shoulders squared, but people noticed. They always do. Neighbors whispered, co-workers watched, and the illusion of stability he clung to began to crack. Then came the sales. First, he sold the flat-screen TV, then the second car. Little by little, the things he thought made him strong slipped away. He told people he was downsizing, pretending it was choice, not necessity. But you can't hide shame forever. It seeps through a man's voice. It follows him like a shadow. One evening, my daughter stopped by his place and found him pacing with an overdue notice in his hand. His eyes were tired, his shirt half unbuttoned, his pride unraveling. He turned to her with the same old sharpness. "Do you have any money to lend me?" he asked. She hesitated, playing her part. "I can help a little," she said carefully. He snatched the envelope, muttered a bitter thanks, and walked away without meeting her eyes. What he never knew was that the money came from me. I gave it to my daughter, and she passed it to him as if it were her own. He thought he had finally squeezed a favor from his sister. In reality, it was still me keeping him from falling off the cliff completely. That night, she came to see me. She told me how broken he looked, how hollow his voice had sounded. I listened, but I didn't answer right away. My heart ached. Every instinct screamed to end this, to walk back into his life and lift the weight off his shoulders. But I remembered the words he had spoken before my birthday. Words you can't unhear. Words that cut so deep they never leave you. This wasn't about punishment. It was about truth. And truth only takes root in a man's heart when he's forced to face it alone. Still, I couldn't keep away from my grandson. Late one evening, I drove by again. The lights in his room glowed. He was at his little desk, crayons scattered around. He looked up toward the window, almost as if he sensed me in the dark. For a heartbeat, I thought he saw me. He smiled faintly, then turned back to his paper. I whispered into the night, "Draw your world, little one. One day I'll step back into it." Meanwhile, my son's world kept shrinking. He stopped answering calls from friends. He avoided places where he might be asked questions. For the first time, I think he began to understand that I wasn't coming back, not in the way he expected. He still had his pride, but pride doesn't pay mortgages. Pride doesn't feed a family. And pride doesn't silence the gnawing thought that maybe, just maybe, the man he told to disappear had been the one keeping everything alive. The cracks had widened, and once a foundation begins to break, the fall is only a matter of time.
By the 4th month, denial had worn thin. Pride, though stubborn, was now carrying him downhill. The house that once stood as his fortress was no longer safe. Notices came with threats bold in red letters. Creditors called at odd hours. His temper grew shorter, his excuses weaker. I heard through my daughter that he had tried everything, borrowing from friends, delaying payments, selling more of what little remained. But desperation has a smell. People notice it, and when they do, they step back. Friends who once lingered at his table now kept their distance. He was no longer the man with security behind him. He was just another man drowning. One evening, my daughter came to see me, her voice carrying both sorrow and strength. "He's unraveling, Dad," she said. "I gave him more this week, but it barely touched the surface. He's starting to look lost." I closed my eyes and held my breath. Lost was the word I had been waiting for, though it tore me in two. Sometimes a man has to lose himself before he can find his way back. At night, I couldn't sleep. My mind drifted to the past. I remembered the long shifts at the mill, the second job at the hardware store, the calloused hands that built his future penny by penny. I remembered nights when I skipped meals so he could eat. I remembered lying awake after his mother died, praying he wouldn't feel the emptiness I carried. He never saw those nights. He only saw the result, the roof, the food, the steady hand pulling him through every storm. And now, stripped of it all, he was beginning to see what it cost me to keep him upright. My daughter told me of one particular night. He came to her door, shoulders slumped, eyes red-shot. He didn't ask this time. He begged. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered. "I need help." She gave him an envelope, money that once again came from my hands. He took it with trembling fingers. For the first time, he said, "Thank you," and it sounded like it nearly broke him to speak it. Still, he didn't know the truth. He thought his sister was his savior. What he couldn't see was that the same man he had wished gone was still carrying him, even from the shadows. That night, he sat in his car outside her house. She watched him from the window. He held the envelope on his lap, staring at it as if it were both salvation and shame. Then, she said, he lowered his head into his hands and stayed there for a long time. I knew what that meant. The cracks were no longer cracks. They were fractures running through his pride, splitting it open. Soon, something inside him would have to give way. But I wasn't ready for what came next, because when pride finally breaks, it doesn't do so quietly. It shatters in a way that forces a man to face everything he's been avoiding, his failures, his regrets, and the people he's hurt along the way.
And that moment was coming, faster than he or even I was ready for. By the 5th month, the walls had closed in completely. My son could no longer pretend. The bills weren't just paper. They were warnings, ultimatums. The house he thought was his fortress was seconds from being taken away. My daughter told me his voice had changed. He no longer barked with arrogance. His tone was thinner, hollow, like a man standing on the edge of a cliff with no ground beneath him. I knew something was shifting. And then she told me of the night everything broke. It was late. He left the house without telling anyone where he was going. He drove aimlessly through the streets until he stopped in front of an old church. The doors were unlocked. He stepped inside. The place was empty, save for the faint glow of candles left near the altar. Dust hung in the air, soft as a memory. He hadn't been in a church for years, maybe decades. But that night, something inside him pulled him to his knees. He sat there in the stillness, at first silent, staring at the wooden cross above him. And then the words spilled out. Words I thought I'd never hear from him. God, I'm sorry. His voice cracked. I've been so blind. I treated my father like a burden, like he was nothing. And now he's gone. If he's alive, please, take care of him. Tell him I was wrong. Tell him I'd give anything for one more chance. Tears came, not the angry kind, but the kind a man can't hold back when pride finally breaks. He wept there in the empty church, his knees pressed against the cold stone floor, his hands gripping the bench as if he could hold on to something stronger than himself. For years he had spoken about me with resentment. For years he had leaned on what I built without seeing the cost. And in that silence, in that old church, he finally understood. My daughter saw him later that night. She said his eyes were swollen, but softer. His voice carried no anger, no excuses. For the first time in her life, she saw humility in her brother. When she told me this, I closed my eyes and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I whispered to myself, it's working. But even as hope flickered in me, I knew the journey wasn't finished. A prayer spoken once in the dark is a spark, not a fire. He would need to walk with that humility in the daylight, face the sister he had leaned on, and confront the truth of what he had done. And so I waited, watching, listening, trusting that God had taken the words he spoke in that church and planted them where no silence of mine ever could. What he didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that prayers don't vanish into the air. Sometimes they move quietly, shaping the path ahead. And his prayer was about to bring him face to face with the very man he thought he had lost forever. The night after his prayer, something in him shifted. My daughter noticed it the moment he showed up at her door. Gone was the sharpness, the restless pacing, the accusations. He stood quietly on the porch, hands deep in his pockets, his shoulders bent in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child. She let him in, and for the first time in months, he didn't demand. He sat at her table, eyes fixed on the wood grain, as if the right words might appear there if he stared long enough. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, almost broken. "I've been a fool." My daughter didn't answer. She let the silence press against him until he continued. "I treated Dad like he was nothing. I thought he'd always be there, paying the bills, holding me up. I thought it was his duty. But he's gone. And the truth is, I don't deserve him back. Not after the way I spoke to him." His words trembled, but they were honest. For the first time in his life, he wasn't defending himself. He was condemning himself. He ran his hands over his face, and then he said something my daughter never expected to hear. "Last night, I prayed. For the first time in years, I asked God to forgive me. I asked him to take care of Dad, wherever he is. And if he ever lets me see Dad again, I'll beg for forgiveness. I'll do whatever it takes." Tears welled in my daughter's eyes as she told me this later. And that moment at her table, she reached across and laid her hand on her brother's. "You still have family," she said softly. "You're not alone. I'll help you." He shook his head. "I don't want your money." But she insisted, pressing an envelope toward him. "This isn't about money. It's about a second chance. Use it wisely." What he didn't know was that the money came from me. Every note in that envelope had passed through my hands before hers. He thought his sister was his rescuer. He couldn't imagine that the father he thought he had lost was still watching, still holding him up, but from the shadows this time. He took the envelope with trembling fingers, but not with arrogance. He held it gently, as if it were something sacred. For the first time, he said the words he had once struggled to give to anyone. "Thank you." That night, after he left, my daughter came to me with the story. She said his face carried exhaustion, but also something new, something softer. Regret, humility, a longing to put right what he had destroyed. I sat alone after she left, staring at the quiet walls around me. His words echoed in my mind, "I'll beg for forgiveness." I had waited months to hear that. Months of silence, watching him stumble, waiting for his pride to fall. And now it had. He was ready, not for comfort, not for wealth, but for grace. What he didn't know was that prayers spoken in empty churches sometimes carry further than we imagine. And his prayer, his confession, had already set the stage for the moment he thought would never come. Because soon, very soon, he would see me again.
6 months had passed since I vanished from his world. 6 months of silence, of shadows, of watching from a distance. I had seen him stumble, break, and finally bend his knees in prayer. I had heard, through his sister, the words I thought I would never hear from him: regret, humility, and the longing for forgiveness. It was enough. That Saturday, I decided to visit my daughter. I wanted to see her, to thank her for standing by me in this plan, and, more than anything, I wanted to see my grandson. He had kept my secret faithfully, believing in the story of Grandpa's trip. That small heart had carried the weight of a promise bigger than he even understood. I parked on the quiet street, walked up the path, and knocked softly on the door. My daughter opened it with a smile that said she had been waiting for this moment as much as I had. Inside, laughter echoed from the living room. My grandson was on the floor, building towers with his blocks. When he looked up and saw me standing there, his eyes widened, his mouth opened, and joy poured out in the purest sound I had heard in months. "Vovo, the grandpa is back!" His voice rang through the house like a bell. It was the cry of innocence, of love unbroken. My son was in the kitchen, and the moment he heard those words, he froze. I could hear the scrape of his chair as he stumbled up. His footsteps were heavy, hurried, and then he appeared, standing in the doorway, staring at me as if the world had tilted off its axis. For a long moment, no one spoke. His eyes searched mine, wide with disbelief, then wet with tears. His lips trembled, his chest heaved, and then, as if the strength had left his legs, he dropped to his knees. Not in anger, not in pride, but in surrender. "Ted," his voice cracked. "I'm sorry." I stepped closer.
my grandson clinging to my hand, pulling me toward him as if to seal the reunion. My daughter stood behind, silent, tears streaming down her face. I reached out, laid my hand on my son's shoulder, and for the first time in months, words came, not sharp, not heavy, just steady. I never wanted you to lose everything. I only wanted you to see what you had. He bowed his head deeper, his tears falling to the floor. I was wrong about everything. You carried me, and I despised you for it. I asked you to disappear, and when you did, I realized I had disappeared long before you. I pulled him up. His body shook against mine as I embraced him, the years of anger breaking apart between us. For months, I had lived in silence. For months, I had hidden in the shadows, watching his pride crumble. And now, in this living room, surrounded by the two souls who had carried the secret with me, my daughter and my grandson, the silence ended. Not with speeches, not with judgment, but with forgiveness. We stayed there for a long time, the four of us. No riches, no grand houses, no illusions. Just family, fragile and real. And as I looked at my son, still clinging to me, I knew the prayer he had whispered in that empty church had been answered. Not because he deserved it, but because grace has a way of finding us, even when we least expect it. I had disappeared once, but this time, I was home.